July 15th, 1916. The Saturday afternoon heat in Charleston, South Carolina, settled heavy over the modest residential blocks where Nassau Street intersected with Cumming Street, creating an atmosphere that drove most residents onto porches or into whatever shade trees could provide. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the temperature had climbed to 94 degrees, making indoor spaces without ventilation nearly unbearable and outdoor labor exhausting. The neighborhood consisted of wooden houses built in the previous 2 decades, some owned by their occupants and others rented, arranged in blocks where black families and white families lived in proximity dictated by economics rather than by deliberate integration or complete segregation. Margaret Moultrie Johnson stood in her yard, hanging wet laundry on clotheslines that stretched between wooden posts her husband William had set in concrete the previous summer. Margaret was 38 years old, a black woman who worked 6 days each week as a domestic servant in white households across Charleston, while also managing her own home and raising 7 children. She wore a simple cotton dress in light blue, appropriate for the heat and for the physical labor of washing clothes by hand and carrying them wet from the kitchen where the washing had been done. Her movements were efficient, or practiced through years of managing household tasks around work schedules that began before dawn and ended after dark. The Johnson family house stood as modest but well-maintained property on Nassau Street, a wooden structure with 3 rooms plus a kitchen addition that William Johnson had built himself shortly after purchasing the property in 1908. The house represented significant achievement for a black family in Charleston during this period. Actual ownership rather than endless rent payments. Stability for children rather than frequent moves when landlords raised prices or sold properties. Foundation for whatever economic security could be built within the constraints that racial hierarchy imposed on black families' economic advancement. William Johnson worked on the Charleston docks, loading and unloading cargo ships, a labor that paid better than many jobs available to black men, but that remained physically demanding and economically precarious. The yard where Margaret hung laundry was small but carefully maintained, with grass kept short and a vegetable garden along one side that provided food for the family during growing seasons. Margaret took pride in the property's appearance despite having limited time for maintenance given her work schedule, and the laundry lines represented one of many small improvements the family had made, installing permanent posts and wire rather than running temporary rope between trees, creating a system that made the weekly laundry task slightly more efficient. Adjacent to the Johnson property stood a similar wooden house occupied by Thomas Patterson, a white man in his mid-40s who worked as a clerk in a shipping office downtown and who had lived in the neighborhood approximately 3 years. Patterson owned his house as well, a structure slightly larger than the Johnson house with an additional room and a covered porch across the front. Patterson lived with his wife Sarah and their 2 children, a boy aged 12 and a girl aged 9. The relationship between the Johnson family and the Patterson family had remained distant during the years they had been neighbors. Occasional acknowledgment when paths crossed, general awareness of each other's presence and activities, but no social interaction beyond what proximity unavoidably created. At approximately 3:15, Patterson emerged from his front door and walked across his yard to the low wooden fence that separated his property from the Johnson property. He stood watching Margaret hang laundry for perhaps 10 seconds before speaking in a voice loud enough to carry not just to Margaret, but to several other neighbors who sat on porches or worked in yards within hearing distance. Patterson stated that Margaret's laundry lines extended too close to his property line, that water dripping from the wet clothes was falling onto his side of the fence, creating muddy conditions, and that he would not tolerate a racial slur, using the most dehumanizing term commonly applied to black people in the American South, having the audacity to create property damage and nuisance conditions that affected white residents. Patterson delivered the slur with deliberate emphasis, repeating it twice to ensure it was heard clearly by everyone within range. The public nature of the statement was unmistakably intentional. Patterson had chosen to address what he claimed was a property boundary issue not through private conversation or through civil communication, but through public denunciation that employed racist language designed to humiliate Margaret in front of the neighborhood. Several neighbors stopped their activities to watch and listen. A woman sitting on a porch 2 houses away put down the sewing she had been working on. A man working in his garden stood upright and turned to observe. 2 children playing in a yard across the street paused their game. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, called Bumpy by family and neighbors due to a pronounced bump on the back of his head resulting from a childhood injury or birth condition, was 10 years old in July 1916. He had been in the backyard with his younger siblings when he heard Patterson's raised voice. Bumpy walked to the corner of the house where he could observe what was occurring in the front yard, but did not approach his mother or the fence where Patterson stood. He positioned himself where he could see and hear clearly while remaining somewhat removed from the direct confrontation. Margaret Johnson did not stop hanging laundry when Patterson began speaking. She did not turn to face him or acknowledge his presence at the fence. She continued the rhythmic work of taking wet garments from the basket at her feet, shaking them once to remove excess water, and pinning them to the clothesline with wooden pins that she kept in a cloth bag hanging from the line. Her face showed no visible emotional reaction. No anger that would give Patterson satisfaction, no fear that would confirm his power to intimidate, no humiliation that would indicate his insult had achieved its intended effect. She simply continued the task she had been performing before Patterson appeared. Patterson apparently expected some response, perhaps an apology for the alleged property encroachment, perhaps an argument that would justify escalation, perhaps some visible sign that his public denunciation had successfully established his dominance and her subordination. When Margaret provided none of these responses and instead continued working in silence, Patterson raised his voice further and repeated his complaint with additional racist language. He added warnings about knowing one's place in Charleston society and about the consequences that befell those who forgot the proper order of racial hierarchy. Still, Margaret continued hanging laundry without acknowledgment. After approximately 45 seconds, during which Margaret maintained complete silence and continued her work, Patterson made a final statement declaring that if the clothesline situation was not corrected immediately, and if proper deference was not shown, he would take whatever action he deemed necessary to protect his property rights and to remind certain people of their appropriate social position. He then turned and walked back across his yard to his house, entering through the front door and closing it firmly enough that the sound carried across both yards. Margaret finished hanging the remaining wet clothes in her basket. She worked methodically until every garment was on the line, then picked up the empty basket and walked toward the house. As she passed near where Bumpy stood at the corner of the house, she spoke quietly without stopping, telling him to come inside. Bumpy followed his mother through the back door into the kitchen. Inside, Margaret set the laundry basket down near the washing tubs and moved to the kitchen table where she sat in one of 4 wooden chairs that William had built. Bumpy sat across from his mother and waited. Margaret did not speak immediately. She sat looking at her hands for perhaps 15 seconds, then began speaking in a calm voice that showed none of the anger or hurt that Bumpy knew she must be feeling. Margaret explained to Bumpy that what had occurred in the front yard was not actually about clotheslines or property boundaries or water dripping from laundry. She said that Patterson's complaint and his use of racist insults served a different purpose than resolving any practical problem. The purpose was to remind black families in the neighborhood that white residents could speak to them however they wished, could question their right to use their own property comfortably, could assert dominance through public humiliation, and could do all of this without fear of consequence or challenge. She said that Patterson had chosen to make his complaint publicly and had chosen to use the most offensive racist language available because public insults served to warn not just the Johnson family, but all black families in the neighborhood that similar treatment awaited anyone who displayed behavior that white neighbors might interpret as forgetting their subordinate position in Charleston's racial hierarchy. While Margaret told Bumpy that responding emotionally to such insults would provide Patterson with exactly the justification he sought for escalation. If she had argued with Patterson, if she had shown anger or defended herself, Patterson could claim she was aggressive or disrespectful toward a white man, which would bring police attention or community pressure that would disadvantage the Johnson family regardless of the actual facts. She explained that silence in such situations was not weakness or acceptance, but was strategic protection of the family's safety and economic position. She said that anger was natural and justified when someone delivered public racist insults, but that expressing anger in the moment would serve the insulter's purposes rather than the family's interests. And Margaret told Bumpy that this was a lesson he needed to learn early because Charleston was full of white people like Patterson who used racist insults to maintain social hierarchy, and that black children growing up in Charleston would face such insults many times throughout their lives. She said the ability to control one's emotional response, to maintain dignity through silence, or to avoid giving insulters the satisfaction of visible reaction, these abilities were necessary for survival and for preserving whatever small measure of security and progress black families could achieve. What Margaret did not know as she delivered this explanation was that Bumpy was processing the incident quite differently than she intended. Bumpy was not primarily absorbing a lesson about strategic silence and patient endurance of injustice, and he was instead developing a realization about the systemic nature of what he had witnessed. The public insult his mother had received was not an isolated expression of individual prejudice by one particular white neighbor. It was an expression of a system, a comprehensive social structure in which white residents could deploy racist language as a tool for maintaining dominance, in which black residents' responses were constrained by the threat of escalation and legal consequences, in which public space itself was organized around the principle that white comfort and white authority took precedence over black dignity and black property rights. This realization did not occur to Bumpy all at once, in a moment of sudden clarity. It developed over the hours and days following the incident as he thought about what he had witnessed and what it revealed about how Charleston actually functioned beneath the surface of daily routines and ordinary interactions. The realization had several components that Bumpy began to understand with increasing clarity. First, Patterson's behavior was enabled by legal structures. If Margaret had responded to Patterson's insults with anger or confrontation, Charleston police would likely have arrested her rather than Patterson, because the legal system treated black assertiveness as threatening and white aggression as justified maintenance of order. And the law did not protect black residents from racist insults or from harassment by white neighbors. The law instead protected white residents' ability to deliver such insults without consequence, while simultaneously criminalizing any black resistance to the insults. Second, Patterson's behavior was enabled by economic structures. Margaret worked in white households, and William worked on docks controlled by white business owners. Both could lose employment if white residents spread word that they were troublesome or disrespectful. This economic vulnerability meant that challenging Patterson publicly could threaten the family's income and therefore their ability to maintain their house and feed their children. Economic dependence created leverage that white residents could exploit to enforce compliance with racial hierarchy. Third, Patterson's behavior was enabled by social structures, and the neighborhood's other white residents had witnessed Patterson's insults without intervening or objecting. Some had watched with apparent approval. None had suggested that Patterson's language or behavior was inappropriate. This collective white silence communicated that Patterson's actions were considered acceptable or at least tolerable within white community norms, which meant that similar actions by other white residents would likely receive similar acceptance. Fourth, Patterson's behavior was enabled by spatial structures. The proximity of black and white families in the neighborhood was organized not around equality or genuine integration, but around white convenience and white comfort. Black families lived near white families because this allowed white residents to easily access black domestic labor while maintaining social distance. The spatial arrangement itself reflected and reinforced racial hierarchy rather than challenging it. And these systemic enablers meant that addressing the insult Margaret had received would require more than just responding to Patterson as an individual. It would require creating consequences that demonstrated to Patterson and to other white residents that racist public insults carried costs, while simultaneously avoiding the escalation that would bring legal or economic retaliation against the Johnson family. This required strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction, a coalition building rather than individual action, and patience to create effects over time rather than seeking immediate satisfaction. Over the 3 weeks following Patterson's public insult, Bumpy began developing networks and gathering information that would serve as foundation for a strategic response. These activities reflected emerging capabilities that would later characterize Johnson's criminal career in Harlem, but in 1916 they were primitive and limited by his age and resources. The first network Bumpy developed involved other young black boys in the neighborhood who had witnessed similar incidents of public humiliation directed at their mothers or other family members. Bumpy identified approximately 6 others aged between 11 and 15 who shared his anger at the racial hierarchy that structured their lives and who were looking for ways to respond that would create consequences for white residents who felt entitled to deliver racist insults without fear. And these boys met informally in locations where their gatherings would appear ordinary, while playing together in areas where black children congregated, while working odd jobs together, where conversation during work seemed natural, while attending church events where young people's presence was expected. These meetings developed preliminary protocols for how the group would operate, and conversations would remain vague enough that specific plans could not be attributed to specific individuals if questioned later. Actions taken by the group would be difficult to trace to any particular person because multiple participants would share knowledge of what occurred, but individual responsibility would remain unclear. Information gathering would be distributed among different members so that no single person's observation patterns would appear suspicious. These protocols were crude compared to the sophisticated operational security that Johnson would later employ in Harlem, but they represented early experimentation with organized collective action rather than individual impulsive responses. The second network Bumpy developed involved observation of Patterson's patterns and vulnerabilities. Bumpy noted what times Patterson left for work each morning and returned each evening, and he observed which route Patterson took walking to and from the trolley stop where he caught transportation to his downtown office. He watched which neighbors Patterson interacted with regularly and which ones he avoided or had tensions with. He paid attention to details about Patterson's property, where firewood was stored, which windows were typically open or closed at different times of day, what routines the Patterson family followed for daily activities. Well, this observation was not conducted obviously or all at once by Bumpy alone. Instead, it was distributed among the group of boys, with different members gathering different pieces of information through activities that appeared routine. One boy who delivered newspapers early in the morning noted Patterson's departure time. Another boy who worked odd jobs for neighbors observed Patterson's return time and his interactions with different residents. And a third boy who played in the street observed details about the Patterson property visible from public space. Collectively, these observations built a comprehensive picture of Patterson's patterns without any single observer spending enough time watching to attract attention. The third network Bumpy developed involved understanding community dynamics among both black and white residents in the neighborhood. Not all white residents actively participated in or approved of racist public insults like Patterson had delivered. Some maintained business relationships with black business owners or employed black workers in ways that created mutual economic dependencies. Some belonged to churches or civic organizations that professed values theoretically incompatible with overt racial subordination. Some had personalities or social positions that made them uncomfortable with public confrontation or aggressive expressions of racial dominance. Similarly, black residents held varying positions regarding how to respond to racist insults and how much risk to accept in challenging racial hierarchy. Some prioritized avoiding any action that might bring police or economic retaliation. Others were willing to support resistance if it could be accomplished without excessive risk. Still others actively sought opportunities to challenge white dominance despite the risks involved. Understanding these variations allowed for strategic thinking about which actions would receive community support, or at least tolerance, and which would be viewed as too dangerous or provocative. The fourth network involved gathering practical knowledge and resources that might be useful for creating consequences that were difficult to trace. This included understanding which locations in the neighborhood were observable by neighbors at different times of day and which were relatively private. It included knowledge of where materials like matches or kerosene could be obtained without raising questions about their intended use. It included understanding of fire safety and firefighting in Charleston, how quickly fires were typically detected, how fire department responded, or what evidence fires typically left that might indicate their origin as accidental or deliberate. By early August, approximately 3 weeks after Patterson's public insult, these networks had produced sufficient information and capability to enable a strategic response. What form that response took remains historically uncertain because no reliable documentation exists of the specific events that occurred. What can be stated with certainty is that on the evening of August 8, 1916, a fire began in a storage shed behind Patterson's house, where firewood and various household materials were kept. The fire spread to the rear portion of the main house before it could be controlled, causing damage extensive enough to require the Patterson family to vacate the property temporarily while repairs were made. The Charleston Fire Department responded to the fire within approximately 15 minutes of it being reported by neighbors who saw flames and smoke. Firefighters contained the fire before it destroyed the entire house, but the storage shed was completely consumed and the rear rooms of the main house suffered significant damage from flames and from water used to extinguish the fire. The fire department's investigation afterward determined that the cause was likely accidental. Careless disposal of smoking materials or an accident involving a lantern were suggested as probable origins, as fires from such causes were common in an era when open flames were used for lighting and heating, and when fire safety practices were less developed than they would become in later decades. No evidence was found indicating arson. No witnesses reported seeing anyone near the Patterson property shortly before the fire began. No materials or tools suggesting deliberate fire setting were discovered, and the investigation concluded that the fire was accidental, and the case was closed without charges filed against anyone. Insurance companies that held policies on Patterson's property paid claims for the damages after conducting their own investigations that reached similar conclusions about accidental origin. Whether Bumpy Johnson or the network of young black boys he had assembled had any involvement in starting the fire cannot be determined from available evidence. What can be documented is that the fire occurred during a period when Bumpy was developing strategic responses to racist public insults, that the fire caused significant consequences for Patterson specifically while not harming other neighbors, that Patterson's behavior toward black neighbors changed notably after the fire, and that Bumpy developed a reputation even in childhood for responding to perceived injustices in ways that were difficult to trace, but that appeared to produce consequences for those who committed the injustices. The execution over time that followed the fire involved not just the immediate physical damage to Patterson's property, but also a series of social and economic effects that built into larger consequences over the subsequent weeks and months. Immediately after the fire, Patterson had to arrange temporary housing for his family while his house was being repaired. This required renting a room in a boarding house several blocks away at considerable expense. The cost of repairs to the house exceeded what insurance covered, requiring Patterson to draw on savings and to borrow money from relatives. These financial strains created stress within the Patterson family that became visible to neighbors through arguments and tensions that had not been observable previously. The fire also affected Patterson's standing among white neighbors. Some expressed sympathy for the loss and offered assistance with repairs or temporary housing. But others began viewing Patterson differently. The fire, even though officially determined to be accidental, raised questions about Patterson's competence and judgment. Why had flammable materials been stored in ways that created fire hazards? Why had fire safety practices been inadequate to prevent such damage? These questions, though never asked directly in ways that blamed Patterson explicitly, created subtle shifts in how neighbors regarded him. More significantly, some white neighbors began reconsidering the wisdom of public racist confrontations with black neighbors. At the timing of the fire, occurring approximately 3 weeks after Patterson's very public and witnessed insults toward Margaret Johnson, was noted by perceptive observers, even though no one stated explicitly that they believed the fire was connected to that incident. The possibility of connection, even if unspoken and officially denied, created unease about whether racist public insults might trigger consequences that were difficult to trace or prevent, but that were nonetheless real. Among black residents in the neighborhood, the fire's effects were different but equally significant. The fact that a white resident who had delivered public racist insults had subsequently experienced significant property damage, regardless of the official determination of accidental cause, created a subtle shift in community understanding of risk and power. The fire demonstrated that consequences could occur, that white residents were not entirely immune from costs when they chose to express racial dominance through public humiliation, and that such consequences might occur in ways that official investigations could not definitively attribute to deliberate action. This shift did not mean black residents suddenly felt empowered to publicly confront white neighbors or to disregard the very real dangers of racial hierarchy. The legal, economic, and social structures that enabled white dominance remained fully in place. But it did mean that white residents might need to consider whether the satisfaction of delivering public racist insults was worth the possibility, however uncertain and difficult to prove, that such behavior might carry costs. The visible, verifiable victory that emerged from this sequence of events appeared in multiple forms over the months following the fire. Most directly, Thomas Patterson never again directed public racist insults toward Margaret Johnson or toward any other black neighbors in the observable vicinity. When Margaret hung laundry in her yard, Patterson did not emerge to complain about clothesline positions or water dripping or any other alleged property infractions. When paths crossed on the street or at the trolley stop, Patterson offered brief neutral greetings rather than confrontational statements. The change in behavior was noted by neighbors who had witnessed Patterson's earlier public insults and who observed the contrast with his subsequent restraint. More broadly, other white residents in the neighborhood became noticeably more cautious about public expressions of racial dominance. Racist attitudes and private discrimination certainly continued. These were deeply embedded in Charleston's social structure and would persist for decades to come. But the frequency of overt public racist confrontations like Patterson's decreased observably. White residents who wished to express racial hierarchies increasingly did so through structural means, through employment practices, through property restrictions, through social exclusions, rather than through direct public verbal confrontations that created witnessed incidents. Among black residents, the months following the fire saw increased confidence in the possibility of strategic resistance to racial subordination. The Johnson family maintained their property, continued their employment, and experienced no legal or economic retaliation from the Patterson incident or its aftermath. This demonstrated that strategic responses to racist insults could achieve protective effects without bringing the crushing consequences that Margaret had feared when she counseled silence and patience. Other black families began more carefully documenting incidents of discrimination or harassment, building records that might support future strategic responses. The legacy of the incident and its aftermath extended far beyond the immediate neighborhood and the specific individuals involved. The patterns that Bumpy Johnson began developing in response to Patterson's public insult would shape his entire subsequent approach to power and resistance throughout his life. When Bumpy was sent to Harlem in 1919 at age 14, relocated because his parents worried that his short temper and insolence toward whites would eventually provoke violent retaliation in Charleston's racial climate. He brought with him the lessons learned from the Patterson incident. The understanding that public insults reflected systemic power arrangements requiring systemic responses. The capability for patient observation and strategic planning rather than immediate emotional reaction. Or the knowledge that coalition building across networks of people with different capabilities created power that individuals could not achieve alone. The recognition that creating consequences that were difficult to trace to specific actors provided protection from retaliation while still changing behavior. These lessons manifested throughout Johnson's criminal career in Harlem. When he worked as enforcer for Stephanie St. Clair during her conflict with Dutch Schultz in the early 1930s, Johnson's approach involved systematic targeting of Schultz's operations, combined with careful coalition building with community leaders and with eventual strategic negotiation with Lucky Luciano. When he negotiated the 1935 agreement that allowed black operators to maintain control of Harlem's numbers rackets while paying tribute to Italian mob families, Johnson demonstrated sophisticated understanding of power structures and their vulnerabilities. When he maintained control in Harlem for decades, despite repeated arrests and imprisonment, Johnson relied on deep community relationships and strategic networks rather than primarily on violence or intimidation. For the Charleston black community, the Patterson incident and its aftermath became part of oral history passed among families and community members. The story was told in different versions with varying details, as some emphasizing strategic planning and others emphasizing mysterious consequences for racist behavior, but all versions reinforced certain themes. Racist public insults were not inevitable or consequence-free. Strategic responses could create changes in behavior even within oppressive systems. Patient collective action could achieve protections that individual emotional reactions could not. These themes influenced how subsequent generations thought about responding to racial subordination. The incident also contributed to Charleston's evolution during the decades that followed. The gradual, incomplete, uneven movement toward decreased overt public racism, driven by economic changes, demographic shifts, national political developments, and local resistance efforts, built on foundations that included countless small incidents like the Patterson confrontation. Each time, strategic resistance demonstrated that racist behavior carried potential costs. At the calculus for white residents considering whether to engage in such behavior shifted slightly. Accumulated across many incidents involving many people over many years, these small shifts contributed to larger transformations in how racial hierarchy was expressed and enforced. For historians studying Bumpy Johnson's life and career, tracing the origins of his strategic sophistication led repeatedly back to his Charleston childhood and, particularly, to formative incidents during the years before his 1919 departure for Harlem. The Patterson incident represents one specific moment within that broader childhood experience, a moment when a 10-year-old boy witnessed his mother being publicly humiliated with racist insults, understood that the humiliation reflected systemic arrangements rather than just individual malice, and then began developing responses that would occupy the rest of his life. The question of whether the fire that damaged Patterson's property was deliberately set by Bumpy Johnson or by the network of young black boys he had assembled cannot be answered with certainty based on available historical evidence. The official investigation determined the fire was accidental. No witnesses reported seeing suspicious activity. No physical evidence suggested arson. Though these findings might accurately reflect that the fire truly was accidental, occurring by unfortunate coincidence during the period when Bumpy was developing strategic responses to Patterson's insults. Alternatively, these findings might reflect that any deliberate fire setting was accomplished with sufficient care and skill that it left no detectable traces distinguishable from accidental causes. What can be stated with certainty is that regardless of the fire's origin, its occurrence and timing created effects that served strategic purposes. Patterson's behavior changed. White neighbors became more cautious about public racist confrontations. Black residents gained confidence in the possibility of strategic resistance. These effects would have been valuable outcomes for anyone seeking to create consequences for racist public insults while avoiding direct confrontation that would bring retaliation. The broader significance of the incident lies not in definitively determining whether a 10-year-old Bumpy Johnson successfully executed arson against a white neighbor, a question that may be fundamentally unanswerable, but in understanding how the incident and its aftermath shaped Johnson's lifelong approach to power, strategy, and resistance. The patterns of observation, coalition building, strategic planning, and patient execution that Johnson employed throughout his criminal career in Harlem had origins in the lessons learned from witnessing his mother's humiliation and from developing responses to that humiliation. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968 at age 62, more than 50 years after the Patterson incident, his obituaries and the tributes from those who knew him emphasized his strategic mind, his ability to build and maintain complex networks, his capacity for patient planning, and his understanding of power structures and their vulnerabilities. These capabilities did not emerge fully formed in Harlem during Johnson's young adult years. They developed from childhood experiences in Charleston, from formative incidents that taught lessons about how power operated and how resistance could be strategically organized. The Patterson incident was one of those formative experiences. A white neighbor delivered public racist insults to a black mother. Had her 10-year-old son witnessed the humiliation and understood that it reflected systemic arrangements that enabled such behavior without consequence. The son began developing capabilities for strategic response, observation, coalition building, planning, patient execution. Whether those capabilities were successfully applied to create the fire that damaged Patterson's property remains uncertain, but the capabilities themselves continued developing throughout the son's childhood and shaped his entire subsequent career. For Margaret Johnson, the mother who received the public racist insult, the aftermath of the Patterson incident must have been deeply complicated. She had counseled her son toward patient endurance, toward strategic silence, toward avoiding confrontations that would bring retaliation. Instead, her son had apparently begun developing approaches toward active resistance, and toward creating consequences for racist behavior, toward challenging rather than simply enduring the racial hierarchy that structured their lives. Whether Margaret approved of or even knew about the networks Bumpy was building and the responses he was developing remains unknown. What is known is that Margaret continued working, continued maintaining her family, continued navigating Charleston's racial hierarchy with the wisdom born of decades of experience. She continued until her health declined in later years. She eventually died, having witnessed her son transform from a Charleston child into one of Harlem's most powerful criminal figures. Whether she saw that transformation as success or tragedy, as vindication or warning, as source of pride or source of sorrow, the historical record does not clearly indicate. For the Patterson family, the fire and its aftermath marked a turning point as well. The financial strain of repairs, the temporary displacement from their home, the subtle shifts in how neighbors regarded them, these effects accumulated into changes in the family's trajectory. Whether Thomas Patterson ever understood or suspected that the fire might have been connected to his public racist insults toward Margaret Johnson cannot be determined, but his changed behavior toward black neighbors suggested some shift in his calculation of costs and benefits of overt racist confrontation. And the neighborhood itself evolved gradually over the years. Following 1916, some families moved away as economic opportunities or housing options changed. New families moved in. The specific individuals involved in the Patterson incident dispersed or died. But patterns established during that period regarding how white residents expressed racial dominance and how black residents responded to racist treatment persisted and influenced the neighborhood's character for years. And Charleston as a city evolved as well, though slowly and incompletely. The overt public racism that characterized the early 20th century gradually became less acceptable in public discourse, even as structural racism persisted through housing patterns, employment practices, educational disparities, and political exclusions. The evolution occurred through countless individual incidents and collective actions, through national political changes and local resistance efforts, through economic transformations and demographic shifts. The Patterson incident was one small contribution to that larger evolution, a moment when strategic resistance to racist public insults demonstrated that such behavior could carry costs, and when those costs influenced subsequent behavior. For students of power and resistance, the Patterson incident offers lessons that extend beyond its specific historical context. Public humiliations intended to enforce hierarchies can trigger strategic responses rather than just fearful compliance. Such responses require understanding systems rather than just reacting to individuals. Coalition building across networks of people with different capabilities creates power that individuals cannot achieve alone. Patient observation and planning can create consequences that are difficult to trace or prevent while avoiding the retaliation that open confrontation would bring. Small strategic actions can accumulate into larger changes in behavior and in power relationships. These lessons applied in Charleston in 1916. They applied in Harlem from the 1930s through the 1960s during Bumpy Johnson's criminal career. They apply in many contexts where people subjected to systematic subordination seek ways to resist while minimizing the costs that direct confrontation would bring. The story of the white neighbor who called Bumpy Johnson's mother a racial slur and whose house burned that night is ultimately a story about the origins of strategic thinking in response to systematic injustice. It is about a 10-year-old boy who witnessed his mother's public humiliation, understood that it reflected structural arrangements rather than just individual prejudice, and began developing capabilities for creating consequences that would influence behavior without triggering crushing retaliation. Whether those capabilities successfully produced the fire that damaged Patterson's property may never be conclusively determined, but the capabilities themselves continued developing and shaping everything that followed in Bumpy Johnson's life.